There we go. I think that's our cue.
It's our cue to stop being rude about Plymouth. It's not
My colleagues.
my colleagues.
Right. Oh, do I need to do that?
Yeah, I guess so.
Good. Okay. Welcome everybody. I'm hoping everyone can hear me online. I don't know if you can signal that. I presume it's okay.
There's a wave.
A wave. Yeah. Good. Thank you, Hannah. Okay. Great. Well, it's a real pleasure to welcome Chris Degeling. I have been told I'm pronouncing that correctly, but there is a Dutch version that's more difficult, which I won't even bother to try with. But I'm not sure Chris can either. Can you?
Intermittently.
Okay. But it's wonderful to welcome Chris. Chris, some of you know well. For those who don't, Chris is an associate professor in health and social sciences and philosophy at the University of Wollongong. He has worked for many years. Lots of us came across his work initially with people like Melanie Rock, thinking about issues like One Health and so on, and human-animal interactions. But Chris is also trained in politics and ethics and has worked on the politics and ethics of infectious diseases. And also because he's embedded within a medical school, or seems to end up on a lot of medical school issues and so on, there's a whole range of works, including technical and systems around medical reasoning and decision making, but also of interest to this centre as well is an expert, and I was already this afternoon getting some learning from him on deliberative methods and processes of public engagement for issues of scientific and technical debate. Chris's background, he has a DPhil in philosophy, is that right?
History and philosophy of science.
History and philosophy of science, but also has before that a bachelor's in social science and science and technology studies.
No,
Oh.
no. Grad diploma.
You've got to update your web. Similar sort of thing, isn't it?
Yeah, well, bachelor's degree.
A qualification in.
Yeah,
A good one. But also, for those who are impressed by the professionalism of my homework, but also, I knew beforehand as well that Chris is also a qualified vet and has practiced as a veterinarian, so has that background as well, and still does some. Hi, come in. Yeah, grab a seat. I'm just expertly introducing our speaker. And also still does a little bit of vet practice. Is that right? No. So put your sick dogs down.
No.
He's not going to help you with that.
I do a lot of counselling.
Okay, right.
A bioethicists, in fact, who have sick dogs.
Okay.
If you,
Okay.
want an hour-long chat on that, I can do that.
Okay, good. Okay. So more recently, Chris has been working on the subject that we're going to talk about today, which is around antibiotics and antimicrobial resistance in relation, especially but not only to One Health issues or livestock issues, but also clinical. And I remember from many years ago when you came, you were doing a lot of senior care as well around those, because there was a project on that, wasn't there? Mm-hmm. And recently has been funded by the National Health Medical Research Council in Australia and the Commonwealth Government fund projects to look at citizen and service users deliberation on supporting essential workers in pandemics, and then technical environment communication of disease surveillance systems, vaccination issues. Chris has worked on that for a number of years, and also in Australia context, the project for TB elimination. I think that's roughly fair. Yeah, so good. An awful lot of work. Chris has also, I should say, published a massive amount of papers. So if you wanted to look at his website, it's well, I found it depressing. No, it's just like I felt inadequate. Okay, so but great. It's great to have you here, Chris. And Chris is going to talk today about antibiotic stewardship and on the agricultural commons. So hand over to you, Chris.
Thank you very much, Steve. I'll just share. I hope that kind of works for everyone. Yep, presume that is fine. So just first to acknowledge that I live and work on unceded Aboriginal land in Australia, a beautiful direwall country, which is just south of Sydney on the coast. And as part of my role there, at some point when all universities had AMR as a global challenge, I was given a pot, well not given, I applied for it and then was gratefully awarded a pot of money to do some work within the local community of the Illawarra, which the University of Wollongong is based in, which is a region which encompasses a lot of dairy farms, which are increasingly being encroached on by dormitory suburbs and development. And then there's also a strong mining history there as well. And looking really at the social and cultural dimensions of antibiotic use, which involves work in aged care, which Steve has already pointed to. But there was this little pocket of project within that, which was actually looking at how AMR is thought about, conceptualised within dairy farming and beef farming in Australia. So what I'm doing today is basically providing a synopsis of that project, and it's social science oriented, but it also has an underpinning in public health ethics. And I guess part of the driver of the project was in some sense a response to sitting in rooms and meetings where people who are very interested in AMR but don't have much experience of agricultural sector or agricultural use may have a lot of assumptions about the drivers of misuse in agriculture, which Steve and I were chatting a little bit about earlier as well. So more concretely, I guess I'd say that the focus of this talk is on how institutional power is used. I just got to get rid of this thing, sorry. Can I? Yes, I can. To shape the use of antibiotics in beef and dairy farming in Australia. As in many countries, Australia, the way AMR has been conceptualised is thought of as being basically the atypical One Health problem. And within how I've conceptualised and taken this forward with the research group that I work with, we've looked at AMR as a policy problem. So thinking about how policies have developed over time to address AMR within agriculture, and then looking at how those policies are being implemented, and then seeing how we have this thing, obviously, in policy science where you never have a clean slate. So how the residues of previous policies are interacting with these new imperatives and new ways of doing things as put forward at that meta level where governments establish regulations or guidelines or institutional trajectories around how we might think of this problem of AMR and how to go forward with it. All of this is obviously being informed by this idea that antibiotics are an infrastructure, and finding a way out of reliance on that as a I guess just transition is the expression that came up earlier today, but finding a way out of having to rely on antibiotics as that infrastructure to do things. Unfortunately, I seem to have lost capacity to move forward, so I'll go down here. Hang on, that's all right. So Klaus Kaschel obviously has done quite a lot of quite excellent work around this, so I won't talk too much about it, but I'm sure most people who have come to this meeting or have some interest in antimicrobial resistance as an agricultural outcome would understand that we don't look after cows and treat them like we used to. Agriculture is now very much centred around or reliant upon the availability of antibiotics to perform certain functions within agricultural systems. Some of these are not necessarily therapeutic. Obviously, there's also preventative measures and usages, and then there's the use of antibiotics in beef and meat production as well as a growth promotant. But the fundamental thing that has happened is that through the 1940s and 50s onwards, that agriculture has become a site in which antibiotics are an essential input into agricultural systems. And that has led them to basically become a key part of how those structures and systems operate, such that removing them has dimensions which therefore you pull the infrastructure away. Then obviously you have to have new ways of doing things on new types of systems to compensate for that loss of AMR as providing, in this case, it's sort of like a safety net or a blanket coverage in how when animals get sick or when you have herds which require antibiotics to be administered to them to prevent diseases of production that are occurring just because the system is stretched in that particular way. So I won't, again, waste too much time informing everyone here about this idea of antibiotics as infrastructures, but just to point to that obviously there are a variety of infrastructures which we might think about. So in the country that I live in, antibiotics are used to support dental health when people can't actually afford private dentistry because we don't have publicly subsidised dental care in Australia. And then there's obviously other forms of infrastructure around sanitation and hygiene, which antibiotics are necessarily quick and efficient and would necessarily argue fair, but it's cheap way of dealing with other global health issues, with Claire Chandler and others have pointed to at various times. Aged care is another setting in which we've done this, and this is part of this project where we looked at what was antibiotics' role, how antibiotics moved around and were conceptualised in residential aged care facilities. And they do a lot of work in those spaces, which I'm sure you're probably aware of. But that work is really quite silent and compensates for higher levels of care, which is probably no big surprise to anyone in this room. In any case, at the sort of the more theoretical level of policy science and thinking about how we might deal with AMR, it's construed quite in popular discourse, and also if you talk to people who work in the professional spaces and professional discourses, as a wicked problem. And it also has this element that it's a problem of the commons, in that there are limited resources with competing needs. There is a requirement for collective action if we are to sustain the resource into the future, sustainability in that way. The wickedness tends to also come from the fact that there is no neat solution which doesn't have costs, and all choices have tragic consequences in one way or another, or place burdens which are considered unfair on stakeholders as currently organised and construed. And the final thing there is also there, in a global sense, even though there are sort of ways in which you can use natural experiments in contexts and jurisdictions, but we really do have limited opportunities to learn by trial and error because there's no real, because we have the spillover effect in the way in which microbes operate within our culture and society and the spaces which they inhabit. There's no clear way of actually measuring success at a global level. So thinking about this as a collective issue and therefore a One Health problem, because it transcends human health and also animal health and the environment as well. In the literature which dominates this discourse in terms of policy and also in terms of how medical professions and public health think about this, agriculture in Australia is construed as a driver of AMR risks to humans. Much of this discourse is focused on use of antibiotics in developing and low to middle income countries, but that still is not necessarily limited to those countries and contexts. There's still a lot of media that appears where infectious disease physicians will quite happily put all agricultural systems into one bag and basically say, it's a problem there, but it's a problem here, and things are measured in tons of antibiotics. So there's the idea that because we use antibiotics in animals and there are so many more tons of animals than humans, that the tonnage of antibiotics in agriculture demands action, even though the use might be justified by different systems. Even though human health is considered to be the most important element in this One Health, obviously there's a dimension in One Health which is very humanist in its orientation. Should I admit someone, or
I can do it. You can
do it. Okay. Agriculture tends, in media and also in professional discourses, again to be sort of pointed to as the whipping child, or as the immediate place in which we need to act here because that's where all these tons of antibiotics are being used, or a sense of lack of responsibility in that sector for using it wisely. So from the nods in the room, I'm guessing that's not necessarily unique to Australia. As obviously with place-based understandings of these things and systems-based thinking about agricultural systems, antibiotics uses have different, so you can't necessarily lump them all together. So part of this project is to actually unpick what it looks like and the whole face of those interactions between prescribers, veterinarians, who are veterinarians in Australian case, farmers and the systems that they interact with, which include food processing and companies, to really understand what role antibiotics play, how it's thought about and what it's construed as doing. The other thing that's informing this, I guess, is that there is except for a number of very specific cases, the evidence of human health impacts from AMR derived from agriculture is not necessarily robust, but is based on a set of assumptions about the transistence of resistomes within and between species of bacteria. So the fact that resistance can be found anywhere means that any resistance is necessarily of medical interest in the way that may not necessarily stand a sort of more strong causal network or inference may. Probably not worth highlighting. The UK does better than Australia in terms of community consumption and hospital consumption of antibiotics. So again, the story that is provided in Australia, at least by the medical side of things, is that agriculture is a big problem, but often it's the prescribed GPs in particular who are showering our population with antibiotics as it currently stands in Australia. That comes back to the culture of use in Australia, which is pretty liberal in the sense that there's a large public campaign, a lot of education around that, but it doesn't seem to make much difference. But as a nation, AMR in Australia is not necessarily a big problem. That compared to elsewhere in the world, we do very well in terms of when it's measured. This has obviously, because we have extensive systems, far more, we have a lot of space in Australia, so our cows tend to be quite spread out. And same with sheep. Pigs don't necessarily have to be housed in piggeries in quite the same way that African swine fever kind of put the kibosh on that in terms of people being quite scared of that going forward. We also have a lot of vector-borne diseases, which seem to have pigs as a host, which is changing the nature of pig industry in Australia to much more intensive systems for biosecurity reasons. But we don't necessarily have these large extensive systems which you see elsewhere. So the use of antibiotics, particularly in beef and dairy, is probably much less than other and more intensive systems in Australia. So that's why agricultural use in AMR is probably less. We also have the benefit of a number of interventions by health authorities much earlier than other countries. So this one report, which happened in the UK here, and I can't remember the exact date in the 1970s, someone might be able to... 72, there you go. It had impacts across the Commonwealth. So as a basis of that report, a number of antibiotics were removed from agricultural use entirely. And then in the 1990s, when the fluquinolones were introduced as a new antibiotic, which was to the armamentum, which is available to medical practitioners of all stripes, it was restricted to not be used in agriculture. So a lot of the resistance which has been driven elsewhere in the world is through excessive fluquinolone use. And Australia hasn't had that issue at all because it's never been part of our food chain. And I think in a talk recently, you spoke of how the response to the chicken industry here was to pump them full of fluquinolones for
Allegedly.
Allegedly.
For a short time.
For a short time. So that means that we've come off a base where antimicrobials are quite limited in their use in Australia. We do have systems, obviously, where veterinarians have access to antibiotics and could choose any antibiotics, but they also have quite tight regulatory structures around there where antibiotics are approved for use for certain species, but you can go off label with a veterinary license if you want to, and you've got a justification. So this project, we then did a policy analysis, which was basically looking at various bodies of policy which sit around antibiotic use in beef and dairy production, looking at guidelines which are put out by professional associations, looking at food safety regulations and standards, and then obviously looking at associated peer literatures and grey literatures that associate around those policies. We also went and spoke to around 20 farmers in the local little well, and it ended up being in New South Wales. I expanded the pool, but the intention was to start quite locally, but we ended up just focusing on one jurisdiction because we have a federated system. So policy in New South Wales is different to Victoria and different other places. The interviews focused on, we spoke to veterinarians, industry representatives, and beef and dairy farmers. Really, these were walking interviews around the farms. generally sort of day-long things where as long as they would put up with us between milkings or while they were doing other things on the farm, and address the things that you can see there, sort of the range of purposes of use, their attitudes and experience of current controls, and the key issues associated with the possibility of introducing further controls and use stewardship measures on their systems. So if we look at the policy sort of analysis and what the outcomes thereof, this is something that's been highlighted by Hannah and Bakerscoff, who are University of Melbourne, when they did a comparative analysis actually of UK and Australian policy on AMR, which are both oriented around One Health. But in Australia, at least, the approach has been much more collaborative rather than sort of regulatory, in the sense that in the medical profession and in the veterinary profession, so those which are the sort of the classic One Health sectors, it's been about bringing people on board as collaborators, trying to get them to do the right thing, but not necessarily imposing sets of regulations on them, and making the obligations that they have to AMR and to antibiotic use, responsible antibiotic use, much more clear. So this is more focused on an education and audit system, which is all voluntary, and therefore also on public education campaigns, which I think you've also had in the UK extensively, which is sort of bus stop billboards and ads on newspapers and those types of things, trying to get the idea across that antibiotic use is a key issue. So this is how One Health is construed of the whole thing, which is really about professional norms and changing professional attitudes and public attitudes as well. But if you look at the actual legislation which impinges upon these things, then the legislation which is to do with the prescription, which is the one side of the dyad between the prescriber and the consumer in agriculture, is much more sort of circular in the sense that it's not very hierarchical, it's not very rule-bound at all. Veterinary surgeons boards make laws based on they implement the laws put in by the Veterinary Surgeons Acts. You have agencies such as the Australian Veterinary Association or professional bodies in conversation with them in a One Health frame, whereas the farmers really are dictated in what they do in terms of how they use and consume and conceptualize antibiotics by food standards laws and acts. And these are much more audit, strong, hard laws, strong, hard thresholds. So there's no kind of fudging at all. It's not sort of, well, we're trying to do the right thing. It's very much, here's a standard, here's a rule, here's a law. If you breach that, here's the consequence. So it's much more enforced and much stronger in that sense. The way in which these laws are produced are oriented very much around food safety, obviously, which is informed by science, but it also has some level of other inputs from industry associations and food processing companies as well. But the key thing to say is that they don't really have a lot of say in it. It's just, this is the law, this is what you need to do to function, and this is how you go forward from there. These are examples of this. So this is all set up around the types of auditing systems, which I know Steve has found in other industries, where they have residue surveys, lots of testing. So anything that leaves the farm gets tested for residues of antibiotics. So that in meat goes through the carcass processes. They have to sign declarations for everything that they do, that there is no, the withholding period has been met. And if they're exporting, then there's a big enough gap between slaughter and the interval of antibiotic use and slaughter. I don't know if you have this in Australia, which have a livestock identification. Sorry, in UK, every cow, you can trace every animal everywhere, every bit of it ends up being, completely audited. Okay. This also with milk quality. So obviously there are tests which are done in terms of milk every time when the milk leaves the farm, when the milk gets to the processing facility, when the milk leaves the processing facility. There are multiple layers of testing for antibiotic residue through all that system. So all of these policies and structures and thresholds and hard, bright lines structure the way in which dairy farming and beef production is done, to make sure that there are no antibiotics in the product that leaves the farm. And this is done on the basis of antibiotic allergies being a key concern, and also meeting export requirements. So obviously, if you're we're a major exporter of both milk products and meat products. And a lot of those treaties rely upon standards and testing which happen in different countries and ways in which this is done. These two bodies of regulation then end up actually establishing what we might think of as two types of policy landscape. So within the vet prescriber side of things, because they have the sole authority to prescribe antibiotics to non-human animals, they've basically embedded this as a moral imperative or a moral norm. So that means that they are the gatekeeper to antibiotics, which obviously provides them with income, and it's a way to generate, it's part of the kudos of the profession to a large extent. They have a voice in the peak bodies that actually collaborate to develop AMR national strategies through the professional association and the power thereof. They are subjected to stewardship education, but that is usually done within sort of a voluntary thing where you have to CPD points. I'm sure you have similar systems here and so on. They have fairly unrestricted access to 3 antibiotic classes. So, but otherwise they can prescribe anything to anything off label. So there's a large sense that if you're a medical professional looking at what the veterinary legislation allows, and this often happens when you talk to medical doctors, they can't believe you've got access to these antibiotics. What do vets need antibiotics like this for, and blah, 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 so on. And if you do use antibiotics inappropriately, then it's really just a slap on the wrist professionally. There's no sort of real consequence in that. Whereas from the policy landscape for the producer side of things is that obviously they can't just access antibiotics, they have to go through veterinary gateway to get them. Their influence on policy process is to lodge submissions rather than having actually representatives in national strategy meetings. So they're outside the One Health discourse as such, even though they're kind of a key output of what One Health might actually entail in that regard. They have programs which are implemented on them by their industry associations and other interested parties, which are usually the food producers as well, which means that they get audited for things like husbandry, hygiene, biosecurity. All of this is oriented around ticking a box saying that the industry is doing what it can to reduce AMR. But the key thing that really works to change what their practices are is residues. So the presence of residues, all systems are oriented around residues rather than AMR. So the focus of the whole way in which antibiotics is used is completely different to how it's conceptualized and thought of in One Health. And the reason for that is that it's completely disastrous or catastrophic to their business if the residues are there. So they have to pay, if their contaminated milk goes to a tanker, they have to pay for the whole batch and make up for the company. If they lose their export license, then that's, their business model has to radically rechange to fit the new way of doing it. So if you look at this landscape and then you think about how you might reduce antibiotic use in agriculture, and this is how it's been conceptualized within bioethics, is they've gone to decision science. And someone who was employed by the American military, Nancy Roberts, I don't know if any of you are familiar with her at all, which she lent on someone who I'm not, Etzioni, who I'll talk about in a minute, without attribution, in fact. And she came up with these 3 ways of thinking about how you might deal with problems of the commons, such as AMR, or super wicked problems. And all of the ways in which these different strategies can be implemented depend on the distribution of power across users and stakeholders within a system which has a wicked problem to deal with. So you can use authoritative strategies, which essentially mean coercion. You can basically tell people this is what we're going to do and like it or lump it. And the way in which that works is that if you have stakeholder systems where you have structures of enforcement, where you have capacity, a lot of power is centralized so that other stakeholders are dependent on one stakeholder to make that call. But the key problem of that is it can also cause alienation in key sectors and actors. So if you're using an authoritative strategy, you've got to have enough power to make sure that alienation doesn't undermine how you're going to progress forward with your agenda to do what you want to do. The other way in which you can do things is using competitive strategies, which is basically a market-based way of approaching things. So you try and incentivize good behavior. But the uptake, the key difference is the uptake is voluntary. And obviously the other key difference is that the uptake also might depend on the size of the incentive. And the final way of doing things is then to use this idea of collaborative strategies, which requires a large number of stakeholders to work together. Main areas of action, sort of awareness ways in education, which we've seen what I've discussed as well. But it also then relies, if you have a collective action problem, then it really does, it's more of an aggregative approach, whereas with authoritative strategies, you get sort of a much more holistic kind of bang for your buck in that regard, because there's no choice. So I won't dwell on this slide too long because I think I've said most of it, but basically if we look at how AMR and One Health have been conceptualised in Australia, it's very much along the dispersal of power model in terms of how the One Health element of it is, which is really wanting to make sure that you have a collaborative strategy, because power is contested. You have sectoral interests in veterinary science, sectoral interests in medicine, public health, and so on, which are all kind of relatively equally positioned. Such that the way forward, which has been chosen in that country at least, is a collaborative strategy. But because the agricultural sector producers have very limited power, then authoritative strategies historically have been ones that have been put forward. So Nancy Roberts kind of stole her map from Amitai Etzioni, who is still alive but has done some really nice basic work in his early work, I should say, in organizational studies. Which is around how if you have an organization, how it can make actors within that organization, or lower level participants within that organization, do what is needed to be done to support the common good, so either reducing AMR or sustaining some resource in the long term. So the key insight of this is that basically for every type of power used, there's also a type of involvement. So coercion works really well if you have a lot of power and you're willing to put up with a high level of alienation. So the model that Etzioni put forward for a coercive system is something like a prison or a school, where those types of system, those ways of involving participants and getting them to achieve an outcome is possible. Obviously, you have your calculative one, which is utilitarian, in the sense that people get rewarded for doing the right thing. And then there's the normative one, which is the moral one, obviously, which is then you try and convince everybody to do the right thing because it's a moral commitment on their part to do so. So all of these different ways of forming, using power to implement different types of policies are not ideals. You can have interactions between them, all of them used simultaneously, but they tend to map on quite nicely if you think about how different policies are being used, different ways of thinking about how you might get AMR to be on the agenda for different organisations, different stakeholder groups, whether that's veterinary prescribers or farmers. It becomes quite clear that there are distinct patterns here that are quite useful to think about if you have moments where you have these things butting up against each other. So the insight is that you basically get best outcome when there's consistency between the type of participant involvement or the level of the type of commitment and the type of control. So if you have a highly morally motivated group of people, then normative arguments are going to work well, coercive arguments are not going to work very well. Whereas if you have a very market-oriented group of stakeholders, then calculative mechanisms are going to work well. Other types of things might cause disruption or contestation. And the other thing is, the bottom point there, that you can't sustainably achieve normative ends via coercive means. So it's very difficult to produce a good around a moral good by coercion, which we've found in this pandemic, obviously, a couple of times that's popped up in that way. But the other thing that can happen is that if the coercion lasts long enough and it becomes in culture, then that actually sets up a normative standard, which then becomes, so the coercion melts back into the background and how society is oriented and how people think about what they're being asked to do. So how does this all play out? So for veterinarians who are being enjoined to use antibiotics responsibly, then they've found themselves in a position where they do have power and negotiation, and they have upper level representation and policy development. Because it's quite chummy in that way, reforms very much focus on awareness raising and education, basically trying to raise the moral tone, or basically use moral pitch and moral argument to force compliance through creating categories of good prescribers and bad prescribers. So therefore, you can be a good veterinarian if you use antibiotics with the objective of reducing antibiotic use. You can be a bad prescriber if you don't think about that as part of the way you think this. The focus of the governing system is antimicrobial resistance. And the goal is to reduce antibiotic supply or protecting animal welfare. So there's, I don't know if it's a mantra that's here, but it's certainly one that I heard repeatedly across veterinary science in Australia, whereas antibiotics is basically as little as possible, but as much as necessary. So compliance is maintained within the profession through normative power and moral involvement. And this basically taps into the veterinary responsibilities, which are really sort of around maximisation of human and animal health while not in a non-malfeasance. So trying to do things that are maximising health, but at the same time without causing harms and burdens through animal welfare or implications in that way. This form of compliance mechanism has obviously some benefits because it's free beyond the awareness raising, so you don't have to invest in enforcement architectures and in systems in that way. And there's no erosion in the trust that your members of your organisation, in this case the veterinary profession, don't erode that through coercion. They still feel like they're in control, so there's no alienation. But the implicit cost of this is also that there's I've already made the point that you don't really have to establish the compliance system as well, but you still get bad apples. So there'll still be people who prescribe badly and don't think the moral argument works. Farmers on the other side of this kind of dyad, prescriber and user. So they've had very limited power in policy negotiations. They have very limited power in most things, it must be said. So PIC industries make submissions, but they're otherwise subject to authority processes and coercive policy decisions of others. Recent reforms focus on awareness raising and education to roll out farmers, but so it still has this awareness raising component. But this focus of the systems is antibiotic residues and not AMR, and the whole orientation of everything they do is very much around that. So their goal is to reduce antibiotic use as a food safety system. So if you use antibiotics and it leaks out of your farm, then it's a major problem for you as a business. So they're just trying reducing their use of antibiotics as an external risk to their business. So it's not framed around AMR, it's really minimising antibiotic use on the agenda, but it's because of the catastrophic risk of letting it leak. So this is enacted through different layers of auditing and surveillance. They have a different set of responsibilities in their antibiotic use, which is oriented around food safety, welfare and productivity. The costs of these systems is that actually they have to fund their own enforcement system. So this is all funded through industry levies that are applied to them. But once the system is up and running, then obviously once you meet the standard, there's no further driver to reduce antibiotic use. So they get set a system and then they work out how to operate in that system, and then they don't have to change. As long as their system works, everything's great. But the auditing systems obviously as well, the way they deal with excessive antibiotic use is often to remove animals which are anomalies within that. They just pose risks in that particular way. Sorry, I might probably running over. No, it's okay. All right. So what can we say about this? Well, it's the most interesting thing, and that probably was a bit turgid and boring, but that actually if you make policy at a national level, it filters down through the organisers and stakeholders and basically to form different types of specific rules and different compliance mechanisms get brought into how it's used. The more interesting thing perhaps is that these governing systems are around sustaining competing common goods. So you have a common good of antibiotic effectiveness, which is how systems are being oriented in medicine and veterinary medicine, whereas the food security is the driver of everything that farmers are doing, and their obligations are much more to that than to preventing AMR. having these different incongruences between the definitions and type of power and the objects of the operating systems in these overlapping stakeholder groups doesn't actually stop the operation of the system. It actually maybe enhances it. So you have ways in which they cover their bases by having these two systems work well together rather than against each other in certain ways. There are problems, however, when you have these clashes of interests and values. When you get to sort of the more rhetoric level or how different stakeholder groups look at each other, then you can cause obviously the type of frictions and heat that you might see here, where health authorities are always wanting more reductions versus farmers who just want a predictable and efficient system. Health authorities and vets see AMR as a moral problem that requires further coercion, but these types of arguments and powers are alienating for farmers, so they tend to see that and just gets their back up. Farmers see antibiotics as a necessary part of agriculture and AMR as an abstract threat. They operate in a calculative position, and that's very bewildering and outrage-inducing for health authorities. So you have misunderstanding and misapprehension across the two groups. So it's more likely, perhaps, for if medicine wants to really, well, I should say public health thoughts around AMR should start to use compliant mechanisms to already operate in agriculture as a way of actually moving forward with that. Public health critiques of antibiotic use in industry really are quite unreflective of much greater complexity of AMR issues compared to antibiotic use in healthcare. So again, plenty of times I've been told that it's out of control in agriculture by medical professionals who have no understanding of antibiotics use in agriculture. Doesn't account for the embeddedness of antibiotic infrastructures. So if farmers are trying to take infrastructures out of farming, but they're taking their time in doing so, and there are little places where they're still left and are necessary to deal with problems as they emerge, which is much more in a therapeutic use, especially where this is in beef and dairy farming. And I think the situation will be different, obviously, in other industries. The focus is really from these critiques is on the liberal regime that operates around veterinary prescribers, but these prescribers can't prescribe all the antibiotics that medical professionals think they do because food safety standards inhibit it. They can't do it. It's just not done. So it doesn't acknowledge the greater range of values and tensions between these types of use in human healthcare, especially responsibilities that farmers have to balance animal welfare, productivity, and affordability. So those clash of goods is a driver of much of the heat in the One Health discourse as seen. I'll stop there.
Thank you. I think I failed as a chair to announce at the start that we now need to take a 5-minute break for the, this was the only job I had from introduce you. We need to take a 5-minute break in order so no one can talk apparently for while the closed captioner has a rest. That's right, isn't it? That's how it works. So we can have a 5-minute break. If anyone needs a comfort stop, then please do. So, and then we'll have some questions for Chris in 5 minutes. Okay.
Would anyone mind if I open the window?
No.
Mute, start my video. Right. Oh, we're right, we're back. Good. Welcome back, everybody. We were silent. And we hope there's going to be time. I've just thanked Chris for his talk. There is now time for questions. We are supposed to finish at 5, but I think we can go on a little bit. That's fine. So I'm going to try and keep an eye on the screen. So please either put something in the chat if you want me to read it out, or raise a hand if you want to talk. I just had a hand over Chris Degeling there, but he's here, so I don't need. But yeah, let me know if you need to chat, and I will open it up to questions and comments. Please, Angela.
Yeah, I'll go. Mostly it's kind of, I mean, great analysis, but the closing part where you were talking about how these systems seem to be kind of almost the conflict is somehow enabling a coordination, but that you've got this unresolved moral conflict. So firstly, I just want to know how on earth that coordination is working, because it's not what you would expect. And secondly, if there is that unresolved moral conflict underneath, are there sort of points where it surfaces?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it works around the definition of necessary. So if the veterinary definition and the farmer definition of necessary is the same, then the conflict is not there.
Okay.
So the farmer will see the antibiotics as being necessary, but the control systems as being appropriate to make sure that they don't. And the veterinarian might see it as necessary as on the basis of animal welfare or sustaining health. But the conflict occurs when the farmer might think it's necessary for some reason that might be to do with their system or whatever, and the veterinarian doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a pretty robust veterinarian who is going to say no, but because it's, you know, it's a business in that regard, and you do have to satisfy your clientele as well. But there are moments and ways in which veterinarians, I think, use these as moral arguments to basically position themselves as saying, well, you can have it this time, but you need to change what you're doing. Or I'm back again, and we've done this 2 times now. You've got to, this is the last, you know, and it ends to, yeah.
Long-term negotiation.
Long-term negotiation usually, but that sometimes hits a hard end point. In saying that, a lot of farmers are desperate not to use antibiotics, and the sort of idea of antibiotics being thrown around liberally to support a system is just, they know that that's a signal that they're going out of business. So, and they will use veterinarians on a herd health basis to consult, to try and work out, all of it data driven, especially in dairy farming, around cell counts of milk and all of those types of things, to remove units from their herd which are problematic. So you do have these sort of overlapping things that work really, really well, but until that definition of necessary changes. But what that also, a lot of the conflict actually goes on sort of above that level, whereas the way in which those systems are thought through, the veterinary side of things is the things that are examined, and that's what judgments are based on, which is really quite liberal in the sense. But the food standards system and the way in which that operates is ignored or not understood. And therefore, the fact that there are only 4 antibiotics that are given to cows doesn't necessarily translate to someone who's thinking about AMR as a global health issue and agriculture as a sort of.
Judy.
Yeah, it was just kind of following on from that, really. I was wondering about the ways in which non-knowledge was kind of circulating in the system, because there's quite a bit of what you might call the double contingency of people assuming what other actors in the system know, like the public health sector assuming that there's overuse in particular areas, or perhaps vets assuming that, I don't know, farmers might want antibiotics and they might not. But how that's kind of in those 3 regimes. Sorry, I'm not actually familiar with that
Vetzioni's thing, yeah.
Vetzioni's kind of map of regimes. But how, because it deals with power, doesn't it? But it deals with presumably power in the sorts of like professional power or kind of that kind of authoritative power.
Yeah.
But not power that might derive from knowledge, and knowledge that is marked as what you know, but somebody else doesn't, or some other actor in the system you're assuming doesn't know.
Yeah.
So I just wondered whether there's anything on that kind of. That wasn't a very well framed question.
No,
sorry,
no,
but it was
no,
just
I
kind of
haven't-
about the what
Yeah,
what's
so what
not
is the,
known as well as what is known.
yeah, so what role does knowledge have within Etzioni's compliance structures? Yeah. I don't think it's explicitly thought of, except that there would be, I guess, those who claim a moral position would assume that they have greater knowledge.
That they've got an overview.
They've got an overview. So we see the problem in ways in which you don't, therefore we're the ones who have the facts to make consistent and fair normative judgments about what we should do about this issue. And therefore, so that would kind of be the overlying understanding of those at the top of the organization would have the power, and therefore they would assume to have the knowledge of how that power could be operationalized to achieve sustaining a common good. And then it's what mechanisms are you using that power to try and make lower level actors do enough to sustain that good. So I think that's how knowledge comes into it. So non-knowledge, if you're using moral arguments, you tend to have to back them up with some sort of grounding in the world to say it's a good thing to do this because, and these are the facts that justify that moral position. Whereas I don't think in calculative systems that kind of knowledge matters so much. I haven't thought about this, I'm just going with it.
Yeah, no, it's interesting, isn't it? How a calculative system might systematically exclude some kinds of knowledge.
Unless it gives you an advantage. So there would probably be a knowledge economy which would emerge around extracting greater value from the system by maximising the return on your incentive, the way in which you can gather incentives. So that might be outcome driven. And then coercion, I don't think there's any need for knowledge at all. It's pretty much
But you don't need to be managing it.
No.
Except that's the resistance, isn't it? That's what farmers are saying is don't.
No, you're right. You're absolutely
But
right.
actually we've got this knowledge that isn't recognised or it's assumed that it's not recognised. Yeah. Okay. So anyway.
As a follow-on from that, is that something to do with, I was kind of interested in what the role of professional identity plays in this.
Yeah.
Because of course, we all kind of know vets as professional identities. Professional identities obviously built on the notion of exclusion primarily, not on qualification or indeed of knowledge, but simply on who you don't allow to do the jobs that you're kind of protecting for the profession. But obviously farmers are also professionals in a very specific way and have their own exclusion criteria. Usually those exclusion criteria around who can own or run a farm and usually run, and this is where kind of hereditary farming kind of, I mean, passing the farm down and things like that have their own roles to play. I mean, it's kind of much more of a kind of an older form of professionalism to do with apprenticeship and things like that. But I was wondering whether there wasn't something in the system that you're describing, with these kind of two competing systems, that almost refuses to recognize the farmers as having a professional identity, and whether that was maybe a source of tension for.
I think that comes back again to what Judith was saying a little bit around the assumptions or the medicalization of it to the extent that medical knowledge trumps all for other forms of knowledge about AMR or antibiotic use. So there is the way in which agriculture is understood is just a bucket in which people pour antibiotics and other things, and then you get an outcome which is food and AMR. But how that is oriented is not well understood at all, and it's kind of erased from the One Health discourse in Australia, certainly. So food production companies and food producers are not in the room when One Health policy is set. The veterinarians are there as the prescribers because they're the ones who have the license to give the antibiotics. So they're and a lot of the ones that I spoke to feel like they're in the middle a little bit in this issue. So they're trying to be good prescribers and trying to manage AMR as a One Health concern, but they understand the pressures in the system that farmers are under. So they're brokering a little bit through that with Angela's question around next time we've got to fix it. This is how we do this so that you don't have this problem in the future. So does that, I think.
Yeah.
There's a massive tension that we've noticed in the field. So vets often resist farmers having a professional identity. And when this comes to, when it comes to, for example, prescribing or diagnosing, they recognise expertise, and often the farmer thinks the vet's got no expertise. So, but they don't recognise, and you haven't got the authority to diagnose or to prescribe, obviously, the farm. So there's a real tension there in terms of identities, and they're worked out. Sometimes, depending if you're male or female vet, how old you are, and so on, and how that authority is communicated, and all those kinds of things. So I think that's quite a big issue. But going back to non-knowledge, I was just thinking of other domains, anti-vaxxers, climate change deniers, and so on, where kind of non-knowledge becomes part of your ability to claim a normative or moral ground, right? That's increasingly become the case, as you say. We don't know what that's going to do.
No.
So therefore, we're taking a moral stand, or a kind of, and refusing it, and kind of grouping together in some kind of platform in order to do that. So it's just kind of, I don't know if that comes into the AMR sphere, because the non-knowledge about resistance effects from livestock or food into human is not being used necessarily. There's been no great attempt to refuse the way in which the food sector has been drawn into this debate, despite a lack of really good evidence.
But I guess if you go back to thinking about, I agree, but if you go back to thinking about how what people who are running or organising or setting policy, they only have three ways of doing it. So the non-knowledge would, you operationalise the mechanism of incentive, or you operationalise coercion to make, so it doesn't necessarily inform what your response is, unless you're totally relying on a moral argument, in which case the non-knowledge becomes an issue, because then you have a different normative position that might necessarily start to work against your one. Sorry.
So I was just going to say, if farmers are led primarily by residuals in meat or milk, what happens to parts of the sector which aren't directly going to contribute to residuals? So beef farming, particularly, the whole lifespan from calf to the point at which residuals will go to meat, that chunk of a lifespan, in theory, you could use antibiotics under the vet's prescription, but with much greater use without affecting. So if their only kind of argument is from that end of the beef cow's life, or the beef, how do the vets have a strong enough argument to the farmers to change behaviour? So, for instance, do you have feedlots in? We
do,
So, and do you have BRD problems in?
That's respiratory.
Respiratory.
Yes, we do.
And is that still heavily reliant on antibiotics?
It is.
And is there any attempt to how do we get to that?
In Australia, so I interviewed the manager of a feedlot of something like 250,000 head, or was it like a quite large establishment, and he was a Texan. So he spent about the first half of the interview complaining about Australia's regulations around antibiotic use and vaccination, and saying we don't have the tools to do this here, blah, 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 blah. But somehow or other he was still doing it. Yes. So they were using antibiotics in that concept. The main difference was you can't use antibiotics for growth promotion. So that seems to be the major restriction. The Cetaphore doesn't have a withholding period in it in Australia, but even though it's a quite high, so there's a lot of resistance though from veterinarians to use that, because they know if that gets on the radar, that they'll get shut down and they'll use it. If it starts to be used as a herd health measure, they'll lose it from the armamentarium for individual animals in ways which aren't useful. So BRD is a problem. I don't think it's a bigger problem as it is in the UK or elsewhere. If you've got feedlotting here,
not really, no, but it's a problem.
Yeah.
But just to follow up on that, I honestly found it quite bizarre that they were focusing on residuals.
residents.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I've never heard of that anywhere else. So is no one is no one trying to understand stewardship from the perspective of use rather than residuals as a kind of, because we don't, in the UK, the whole thing is organised not around residuals, which was kind of cracked years ago. And most farms are pretty good at obeying withdrawal periods.
Yeah.
And they know that's a kind of toxicity issue in foodstuffs,
Yeah.
not an AMR issue. It's a completely different kind of issue. So the whole aim here has been to kind of build up national data sector by sector on how much is being used, milligrams per PCU, all that kind of stuff, in order to have an
auditing system.
a baseline, and then try and see how stewardship affects that. But nothing to do with residuals. It seems to be a bit of a red herring.
Well, no, that's how the farmers are operating. So antibiotic use is not AMR is not a primary concern. That's not their responsibility. It's the vet's responsibility. So the way,
Well,
the vet's the professional has the license to give them antibiotics. So if the vet does their job, then they shouldn't have to be responsible for the outcome, except if it ends up in the product that they're selling. So it's their responsibility to not sell it before the withholding period is gone or within the thing. So I guess the point is that the system, farmers aren't thinking about AMR. They're thinking about residues. That's how their systems operate. There just happens to be an overlap that low residue or non-residue systems use less antibiotics than ones where residue.
So all the responsibility is placed on the veterinary prescriber, because farmers, they're not. You're right. You could use tons.
Yeah.
And often in the first few months of an animal's life is where you probably use.
They're all done under veterinary prescription.
Yeah. And do the vets have enough control? I feel in this country, and I don't know if this is true, but I feel like if a farmer has a really strong desire to use antibiotics, even to prop up a bad system, if his vet won't do it, he'll probably be able to find a vet that will.
No, we've got lots of evidence of that. I'll just say, the vets feel that as well. They say, if I don't give them some now, I know they'll go to our competitor.
Yeah, which makes it a really hard argument for the vet to be in control of the farmer, but we're trying to inflict a moral argument on someone who's not kind of within that moral bubble.
Won't work.
Yeah.
No.
So in our system, I guess, as you've probably heard me talk about, the food auditors become the key, because we've got that nice triangular relationship where the farmer's saying, I can't use it because red tractor won't listen to me. The vet's saying, you've got to treat them, otherwise they're going to be really ill.
Yeah.
And and then they're in that sort of, and they've got to kind of, and they play, and in some way, the power is kind of moving between all these kind of areas. There's some coercion from the food sector, from the processors who have to meet their baseline levels. The vets are kind of worried. On the one hand, possibly selling drugs would be good, but I've also got my version of the Hippocratic Oath to treat animals and make sure they're okay. And then the farmer, who's not always as instrumental, but they're running a business and they're facing all ways. So it's quite a difficult relationship sometimes. But residuals don't really come up in the UK. Do you want to come in then? Sorry.
No. I think those producer groups do have quite a big impact, and I wonder if you have the same in Australia, where they within dairy farming, there's supermarket-led producer groups, and they're not entirely farmer-led, but there's an idea that the farmers have a voice and they're being heard. And I think, and the sort of collectivization that we're all in it together, we're all trying to reduce antibiotic usage. And it seems to work quite well, I think, in the UK, having farmers that talk to each other and feel like they're part of something and they're being heard. And just the idea that they're being heard, I think, helps possibly sort of spin the whole system.
Yeah.
Does that happen in Australia? Do you have?
It does,
Yeah.
I don't think I've said something radically different to what Steve just described. Maybe I did.
It's the residue thing that's got me kind of as a
when the interviews that we did and spoke to farmers, if you spoke about antibiotics, they flipped to
interesting
residues.
So when they're doing like mastitis or something like that, well, sorry.
Is it because the residues and residuals of a previous policy regime?
No, the thing, if you spoke about antibiotics, to say, well, obviously you need to treat sick animals because we've got a welfare obligation. But the key driver which determines use in terms of my system, I'm trying to develop a system that I can stop antibiotics leaking in products out into the world, because I'll get hammered.
And it makes more sense within dairy, perhaps, because you can see that pot of milk not going into, you're not selling that pot of milk.
Yeah.
Only it's very visual, but in beef, where you've got this whole chunk of life where you can use it without necessarily in any way affecting your own product or improving your own product.
But even in dairy, you have a drying off period, don't you, where you can, they still use it for mastitis and so on quite heavily sometimes if they're not.
Some do, some don't, yeah.
That's changing in the UK. I think that with a sort of vet and farmer-led kind of idea, that we can all change.
Mm.
But I don't know, I don't see the same thing happening around BRD, and not so much a UK problem perhaps, but.
No, I think, well, the main thing that was spoken about in terms of, again, was we need to use the feedlot obviously want much more liberal regime and antibiotic use than your average. Someone who's on an extensive system who sees their cows once a year doesn't treat sick animals. So, unless it's an animal of value, so if it's a bull or whatever, then that's a different kind of category. So the key thing was, though, if they were using antibiotics in any sense at all, and there was some beef production which is much more intensive than just the more extensive see it once a year kind of farming, then they were worried about export. So the way in which the carcass quality and the measures and presence of antibiotics in carcasses would shut down their license, they'd lose their license as a beef exporter. So, which means that then they have to stay domestically. And then it's a different,
Right. I just want to follow what Steve mentioned about the shifting power, because within dairy, the cattle industry, we got dairy, we got organic, and then commercial, and then small breeder or corporate, and then for vet we have corporate vet and private vet. All those situations make the power distribution very differently. Like we interview a lot of corporate vet because of the corporate policy that we have contract with the farmer. So that's why a big amount of and have been distributed. And then for the farmer, because of the corporatization, they don't have any knowledge about antibiotics because they don't know what type of drugs they are using. Because you can ask my vet, I don't know. This is
really?
Yeah.
No, I didn't. Every farmer I spoke to had a good idea of what was going on.
I mean, so some of them might, but it is kind of interesting about this kind of like prescription is more complex. Behind there's a context that or situation maybe make it more entangled. That who is responsible for the antibiotic use, That also very stressful. They feel like they are like a cushion between farmer and corporate. If I lose my customer, then who is responsible for my business? So there are lots of, I think I'm quite sympathetic to this kind of discussion. Yes, it is really fussy about who is responsible. My question is very difficult to analyze, that kind of like, I like the structure about the power, the role, but sometimes it's lots of in between. Sometimes it's not clearly, or sometimes shifting or not fixed it.
No, I said there are ideals and more than operate, they can operate in different levels in different ways at once. But yeah.
I agree, but I think the contract or the relationships through contracts make these quite muddy. So the farmers contracted to, often for dairy, for Arla,
to a producer,
pretty much dominates dairy farming in the whole of Europe. And then the veterinary firm may have a contract as well to Arla or to a group of farms. And that's, these kind of all need managing, and that's where you get these multiple values coming to play in any kind of.
So that's a level above where I was at.
Right.
So the pool of people that I spoke to that weren't in that very large, that kind of overarching corporate dairy. There are dairy collectives which there's dairy farmers, Norco, all these kind of blah, 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 blah. They don't have veterinary contractors to their production company. They're still, every farmer I spoke with had a veterinarian who was an independent practitioner, not tied to their production. So their income wasn't coming. I guess what I'm trying to say. It's very different, actually.
Yeah, I've been really disappointed that the world's not like James Herriot when I grew up watching these people giving birth to cows and kind of being called out in the night, and actually they're kind of business people who basically do production management, and that's where they don't know what drugs are going on because they're kind of basically delivering, you know, what is
The cocktail.
So these processes are super powerful, I think.
Yeah, so that's a corporate structure that hasn't necessarily infected, which probably is why you're all looking at me as if I'm from.
No, we're not.
Yeah, the last thing is the dairy farmer in the UK, they're really part of the web checker schemes. But it is kind of oxymoron. On the one hand, they are part of this identity. We got the kind of certification, but on the other hand, they're really sick of the paper filling, tick boxes, always complaining, oh, this is a tick boxes. Lots of managerial work is not relevant to my business. However, sometimes it become a shield to defend that, oh, this is, we passed it. That kind of oxymoron appear in terms of like a kind of symbolic power to make them feel better. I don't know whether it is a moral standard or kind of like real power on the farmer.
Yeah, I was wondering about that. Because that's not just in kind of beef and dairy, that's kind of right across farming. I remember it from way back doing stuff on sort of chemical residues, that those regulatory schemes that come from the supermarkets are experienced as very disempowering by the farmers. A lot of the time, I remember like doing an interview and the farmer kind of getting out this big file and going, look at all this stuff. You know, it's so annoying, it's such a waste of my time, but we can't sell anything without participating in these schemes. So like the whole stranglehold that the supermarkets have here, and that's much bigger issue than just about this sector. But it's why the residue thing again is interesting.
Very interesting.
Because of that, because yeah, it makes me wonder how much that's then being framed in terms of general environmental pollution rather than specifically about AMR or actual, you know, microbes or living animals. That it's a very different framing, which is kind of what you're saying anyway. But I'm just thinking about the power relations between government and industry and the vets and the farmers and how that's different in different countries. Sorry,
it's interesting that I think in the dairy and cattle there hasn't yet. So although I was saying you need data, well, I know anything about data, but pigs and poultry have agreed those data units and norms and so on and targets. They haven't been agreed in dairy yet, and it's probably about 10 years since they've been trying to get agreement on them.
Wow.
So there's something wrong with dairy. They're finding, and I think in Britain it's the heterogeneity. So there's so many different chicken. You can pretty much sort out. Most chicken farms are pretty similar to one another. You know, there is organic and free range and so on, but largely it's pretty similar. Dairy is quite difficult, I think. Is it?
I have a theory that there's a because with pigs and poultry you can buy a plot of land as a non-farmer and set up a pig or a poultry farm with just a bit of capital outlay. You end up with a different group of people coming in who are part of the discussion, whereas dairy farms you can't buy a dairy farm, you know, that's not really an option. It's got to be something that's inherited, and I don't know what the figure is, but it's a vast amount of dairy farms.
I think that's partly true.
And that does
Chicken farmers were often ex-military people who were demobbed after the war. That's why it really took off in the 1950s.
Yeah.
People used their demob money
Yeah.
to build a little thing and just chuck their chickens in.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're right. There's a low, it's a bit like hairdressing, it's a low kind of capital outlay.
Yeah, and there you get a different.
Everyone's got so many hairdressers in. You don't have to buy much
Surely chicken farmers and alder shutters.
Sorry, I'm learning mouth.
Next project, hairdressers. Okay, any questions online? Sorry, I've been keeping an eye, but wonderful conversation. Thank you, Sebastian.
That was 7 minutes ago.
Yeah, okay. Rebecca, Bridget, anyone else? Any questions? We got here is okay.
I'm here just saying, I think it's just me left online, Charlotte, and I say I'm really enjoying listening and having the conversation. So nothing else to ask, but really fascinating points. And I'm trying to already head spinning in other directions about your authority, power framing as well, Chris. Thank you so much. Such a stimulating talk. And there's something wrong with dairy farmers, apparently. This is really interesting. Or dairy farms. This is Steve's soundbite from.
Oh, don't attribute anything to me.
Yeah.
Sounds like they're inbred.
Hmm?
Well, you can't buy, I can't believe you can't buy a dairy farm.
You can.
Well, you
You
can,
need a lot of money, though, don't you? It's not so approachable from the outside. As a business person, you can buy a chicken farm or a pig farm, and
Right,
so you get. I don't want to sound insulting to farmers, but you get business people who are primarily business people and identify as business people going into it.
Mhm.
Whereas the majority of dairy farmers have been born dairy farmers, or there are corporate ones now, but I feel like there's a different group of people, and that's why there's discussions
Yeah.
about setting.
Yeah.
That's my theory.
I guess there's some hobby farmers who get a few cows or a few goats or a few sheep
Yeah,
and start
yeah.
making stuff. But yeah.
Long-term lineage with herds, right?
Yeah,
Also
is
being
that as well,
like
isn't it?
a herd, you kind of build up a genealogy for your
Until they
herd.
get TB.
Until they get TB and then you. Yeah, but that's why there's an entire thing about,
Yeah.
farmer suicides, right? Like.
Yeah, no, it's huge. That's been huge. And but it's the same with sheep as well, certainly herds, and especially using common land and so on. Okay, Chris, thank you so much for opening that up. Really useful and and that's it. Until next week, we've got Anne-Marie Mole coming, so please do sign up for that if you're around, and that would be good too. I can't guarantee she'll talk about.
We have my-
I'm sure she's got a solution to dairy.
Probably has.